Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at A Republic, Not an Empire by Patrick J. Buchanan. So in a previous episode, the last time I reviewed a book by Pat Buchanan, I mentioned that after the 1996 election, he began a project of writing out some books explaining why he was running for president. He put out a series of 3. The first was The Great Betrayal, and that was the last Buchanan book I reviewed, where he talks about protectionism. And the second in that sequence is this one here, A Republic, Not an Empire, from 1999. And in this one, he talks more about foreign policy, and he takes what I am comfortable calling an isolationist position, or neo-isolationist, or non-interventionist is usually the more comfortable way of saying it. But I'm not uncomfortable with isolationism, but to each his own. I don't think we should allow other people to define the words that we use. We should kind of seize control of our language, and I think we probably should isolate ourselves a little bit from the rest of the world. Other countries do well at that. China doesn't concern itself with an awful lot that happens outside its immediate borders and outside its immediate sphere of influence, and that seems to be working well. And we've been calling them isolationist for a long time. They trade with the rest of the world, but they don't get entangled with the rest of the world in the same way that we do. Isolationism doesn't mean you refuse to trade, you refuse to interact. It just means you refuse to entangle. This book, like others of Pat Buchanan's, is in the form of a history book. It walks through the history of our international relations in the same way that The Great Betrayal walked through the history of American international trade. We get the history lesson from the perspective of foreign policy. And I want to pick up where the last episode left off, actually, jumping right back to Woodrow Wilson and the end of Wilson's term. And the end of the war. One of the things Wilson is known for are the 14 points that he tried to establish unsuccessfully, tried to establish as the terms of peace at the end of World War I. They were seen as sort of idealistic, and he was somewhat uncompromising, and they didn't become the terms of the peace after World War I. It was largely France that determined the terms of the peace. And the peace after World War I was very punitive against Germany for starting the war, theoretically, because Germany had lost, of course. And so the terms of the peace were very punitive against Germany, and that was potentially one of the things that led to World War II. So, would things have been different if Wilson's 14 points had been adhered to? Maybe. It's hard to say. Pat Buchanan is not as hard on Wilson as Jonah Goldberg was. Jonah Goldberg was very hard on Wilson. He called Wilson America's first tyrannical dictator, I think was the term that he used. Or the world's first fascist dictator, something like that. Anyway, Goldberg was not friendly to Wilson. Buchanan is critical of Wilson, certainly, but I don't think he's quite as harsh on Wilson. But Wilson did fail to get his 14 points adopted, and he also failed to get the League of Nations adopted after World War I He wanted America to join the League of Nations, which was a sort of prototype for the United Nations that we have today, and he couldn't get the Republicans to get on board with his League of Nations. And the Republicans, led largely by Henry Cabot Lodge, but others as well, shut down the League of Nations proposal, and that was we never joined it. And so in this episode, I want to talk about those situations a little bit, and then I also want to jump forward later in the book when he begins to address the end of the Cold War and the current era a little bit as well. But we'll start with Wilson. So like all my episodes, I'll be reading a couple sections here, providing a little bit of commentary. Looks like I have, 6 or so sections, 5 sections I want to read. Starting with the end of World War I, where he says, quote, "More than any other man, Wilson had failed at Versailles. The Germans had agreed to an armistice based on the president's word that the 14 points would be the basis of peace. While Wilson could not dictate terms to the Allies, he had a moral duty to oppose the dishonoring of his commitments. But he failed to halt the amputations of the German nation. What Wilson brought home was Clemenceau's Treaty of Vengeance, imposed in violation of everything he had pledged. All he had to show for it was Allied agreement to join his League of Nations, a Western-dominated parliament of man that Wilson believed could forever enforce peace, but that his critics said was nothing more than a scheme for the preservation of the British Empire. Perhaps there was truth in the savage verdict of his own Secretary of War, Lindley Garrison, that Wilson was a man of high ideals and no principles. France's position is understandable. Crushed in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, invaded in 1914 with 1,350,000 dead, 3 million wounded, and lands ravaged by 4 years of trench warfare, France was determined to punish Germany and eliminate it as a threat. "There are 20 million Germans too many," Clemenceau once blurted. France's goals: strip Germany of its fleet, deny it the right to maintain an army, reduce its population by tearing off provinces, destroy its capacity to recover by seizing or crippling its industrial heartland, and crush it with debt. France's desire for revenge may be understood in terms of European power politics, Franco-German history, and the horrific losses France had just suffered. But Clemenceau's demands only underscored the point. These old-world hatreds and quarrels were none of America's business. Versailles was worse than an unjust, dishonorable peace. It was a historic crime, justifying Senate rejection and repudiation of Wilson's League of Nations, which would have required American soldiers to enforce it. Wilson had forgotten the wisdom of his own words that January day in 1917 when he warned against a victory that would mean peace forced upon the loser, a victor's terms imposed upon the vanquished. It would be accepted in humiliation, under duress, at an intolerable sacrifice, and would leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory, upon which terms of peace would rest as upon quicksand. So it did. Defenders of Versailles retort that what the Allies did to Germany was nothing less than what Germans had done to a defeated Russia at Brest-Litovsk, where in March 1918 Berlin had stripped away Poland, the Baltic republics, and Ukraine, or what a victorious Reich would have done to France. Had not Wilhelm I and Bismarck demanded a huge indemnity of a defeated France in 1871? All of which may be true, none of which was relevant. Versailles was an act of colossal stupidity. Instead of tying a defeated Germany to the West, it drove outcast Germans to collude with that other pariah state, Bolshevik Russia, in the Rapallo Pact of 1922. Decrying the injustice of Versailles would become a universally popular plank in the platform of the Nazi Party. As Kennan wrote, "Truly, this was a peace which had the tragedies of the future written into it, as by the devil's own hand. It was a peace, as the French historian Bainville said, which was too mild for the hardships it contained. And this was the sort of peace you got when you allowed war hysteria and impractical idealism to lie down together in your mind, like the lion and the lamb, when you indulged yourself in the colossal conceit of thinking that you could suddenly make international life over into what you believed to be your own image. The war's carnage, the hatreds engendered, and the lust for vengeance blinded the Allied statesmen. They could not see that with Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin coming to power in Russia, a unified democratic Germany was Europe's bulwark against the rise of totalitarian barbarism to the east. Rather than create conditions from which such a Germany might emerge, the Allies stripped it naked and tore it apart, discrediting German democracy at birth by forcing its diplomats to sign a peace no patriot could defend. Wrote Keynes, "Never in the lifetime of men now living has the universal element in the soul of man burnt so dimly." Moreover, it was not a workable peace. By dismembering the most powerful nation in Europe and surrounding it with weak neighbors against whom Germany had huge grievances, the treaty makers had scheduled a war of revenge and reunification once Germany got to its feet. End quote. So here you see Pat Buchanan is quite critical, and he's certainly not the only one of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, that Germany, he says, was stripped naked and dismembered. It had sections of it torn off and given to its neighbors. It was very punitive. It was loaded with debt. It was a very punitive peace terms that were imposed, and it had nothing to do with what Wilson had wanted. He had wanted something totally different, and he didn't get it. The Allies got it, and he says it's understandable that they were like this on account of all of the defeats that they had suffered, and maybe the Germans would have done it to them, but at any rate, no matter how you slice it, it was stupid. It scheduled another war. It scheduled a war of revenge and reunification once Germany got to its feet. Germany was powerful. It was surrounded by weak neighbors against whom it had grudges. And he says that Soviet Russia was on the rise already. It was just in the earliest stages, but communist Russia was on the rise, and Germany needed to be brought into the West as a bulwark against the Soviet Union rather than made into the victim of the West that would then turn to Russia in 1922, and then Germany would sign a peace treaty with Russia and turn against the West. So we can see Pat Buchanan is not a fan of the sort of punitive Treaty of Versailles that continued the European war ongoing for round two. But at any rate, Wilson did come home with the League of Nations proposal and continued to try to get Americans to join the League of Nations. If he couldn't have his 14 points peace treaty, he could at least get his League of Nations. But that didn't go well either. So he says, quote, "On March 3rd, 1919, near midnight, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who had vowed to kill Wilson's League of Nations, this evil thing with a holy name, showed his hand. It was a strong one. Lodge introduced the Republican Round Robin, signed by 39 colleagues, well over one-third of the Senate, enough votes to kill the League and the entire treaty. Resolved that it is the sense of the Senate that while it is their sincere desire that the nations of the world should unite to promote peace and general disarmament, the Constitution of the League of Nations, in the form now proposed to the Peace Conference, should not be accepted by the United States. Message to President Wilson: unless there are changes in the League to protect America's rights, we have the votes to keep the United States out." But Lodge knew that if Wilson made concessions, the president would win. Arrogant, proud, and stubborn, Wilson defiantly announced he was going to ram the treaty and League through the Senate as written. How? By tying the treaty and League together and forcing the Senate to vote up or down. When the treaty comes back, gentlemen on this side will find the covenant not only in it, but so many threads of that treaty tied to the covenant that you cannot dissect the covenant from the treaty without destroying the whole vital structure. The structure of the peace will not be vital without the League of Nations, and no man is going to bring a cadaver with him. Would Wilson entertain reservations to his League? I shall consent to nothing, the President said. The Senate must take its medicine. As historian Walter McDougall writes, the Senate refused the spoon. In many histories, Wilson is portrayed as a martyr to peace, whose League of Nations was a bold and idealistic institution that would have enabled America to play its rightful role in the world and prevented World War II. To the contrary, American membership would have produced a debacle. Not only did the League contradict the counsel of Washington and Jefferson to stay aloof from European politics and avoid permanent and entangling alliances, but had America joined, U.S. troops would have been called upon to enforce a dishonorable peace. Were Americans to spill the blood of their sons to enforce a peace from which all the victors had grabbed territory and booty but the United States? To have joined the League as founding father and most powerful member would have put America into the middle of every ethnic quarrel and nationalist conflict in Europe, including the clash between Great Britain and the Irish. Irish Americans were outraged. They believed that Ireland's right to independence had been compromised. German Americans saw Versailles as a piece of vengeance. Italian Americans were enraged that Wilson had supported Yugoslavia's control of Fiume. This treaty, said the Springfield Republican, was dictated in a paroxysm of hate. It is a myth that reactionary Republicans killed the treaty. Opposition came from every quarter. The battalion of death was led by the great progressive Lion of Idaho, William E. Borah. Had he his way, the senator roared, Wilson's League would be put 20,000 leagues under the sea, and this treacherous and treasonable scheme buried in hell. End quote. So you see a whole bunch of opposition. The progressive Lion, he says the battalion of death, talking about the opposition to the treaty, led by the great progressive Lion of Idaho, William E. Borah. So the progressives were opposed to the League of Nations just as much as the conservative Republicans were opposed. Irish Americans were outraged. German Americans were outraged. People were worried that Great Britain was going to use the Treaty of Versailles, going to use the League of Nations to bring American troops into the conflict between Great Britain and Ireland. It would have bound us into all of the ethnic and nationalist conflicts of Europe. And so probably a good thing, I think, that we didn't get involved in the League of Nations. It would have involved using American troops to enforce the Treaty of Versailles. But Wilson was stubborn, and he didn't want to budge on any of it. He didn't want to change anything, didn't want to revise anything. Even after his 14 points collapsed, he stuck to his plan, and it didn't really work. So moving on from there to continue the discussion of the conflict over the League, Buchanan says, quote, Lodge and his allies appended 14 reservations to the League. As McDougall writes, clearly these reservations were designed not to gut the peace that Wilson had fashioned, but to ensure that his new order did not gut the sovereignty and constitution of the United States and the Monroe Doctrine. Adds historian Paul Johnson, the Europeans would have accepted Lodge's reservations and in some cases welcomed them. Even House and Bryan favored the reservations. But the president, who had given the rapacious allies all they wanted at Paris, at the expense of his own principles, refused to compromise with the Republican Senate. Nor would Wilson accept any weakening of Article 10, which bound the United States to preserve, as against external aggression, all of the territorial integrity and existing political independence of all League members. To Wilson, this was the heart of the covenant. To California Senator Hiram Johnson, Article 10 meant the British Empire can demand American blood to subdue Ireland. A delegation from the Foreign Relations Committee confronted Wilson in the White House on Article 10. Wilson failed the test. The senator who called him out was Warren Harding. It was on Article 10 that Wilson lost the support of Herbert Hoover, Calvin Coolidge, Charles Evans Hughes, and Henry L. Stimson. While these men did not wish to be associated with the imperialism of old-time expansionists like Elihu Root and William Howard Taft, they were even more averse to the moral imperialism of Wilson. By refusing to take the Republicans to Paris to give Congress's majority a hand in and stake in the treaty, by insisting any alteration was a breach of faith with Britain and France, Wilson painted himself into a corner. There was no escape once the Senate determined to exercise its constitutional right. Thus, when the vote came on the treaty with the Lodge reservations attached, Wilson instructed Democratic senators to vote no. They joined Johnson, Borah, and the irreconcilables and together killed the treaty. Several Senate Democrats proposed milder reservations, which would have enabled the treaty to pass, but Wilson, who saw them as concessions to the hated Lodge, recoiled, "Never, never! I'll never consent to adopt any policy with which that impossible man is so prominently identified." Democratic Senator Harry F. Ashurst of Arizona said bitterly, "As a friend of the president, as one who has loyally followed him, I solemnly declare to him this morning, if you want to kill your own child because the Senate straightens out its crooked limbs, you must take the responsibility and accept the verdict of history." Wilson did. Subsequent efforts to revive the treaty with the reservations failed. The irreconcilables would vote the treaty down, and Democrats loyal to Wilson would help them kill it. Said William Howard Taft, "Wilson's greatness is oozing out, as it ought to. He will live in history as a man with great opportunities which were not improved, but which were wrecked by his personal egotism, selfishness, vanity, and mulishness." Taft was right. Far from being isolationists who wanted to turn their backs on Europe, Lodge Republicans and many progressives wanted America to play the lead role in the rebirth of Western civilization. What they would not do was surrender America's sovereignty, its freedom of action, or the hallowed tradition that Americans alone decide when, where, and whether the Republic goes to war. Irreconcilables and Roosevelt Lodge Republicans agreed that only Americans could be relied upon to defend the national interest, which must come first. Wilson was defeated because he placed his vision above his country. He had failed to put America first. End quote. So there you see that ultimately it was brought down by Lodge. Lodge and his allies appended 14 reservations, but Wilson wouldn't accept any reservations or any changes. He says that the Europeans would have accepted Lodge's reservations. The League of Nations would have passed had the reservations been accepted, but Wilson was stubborn and refused to accept any changes at all, even the changes that were proposed by Democrats that would have allowed it to pass. He said no, no, no. He won't do anything that could potentially be associated with Lodge. He hated Henry Cabot Lodge. And it's really Article 10, and you see people tried to convince him. People went to the White House to try to convince him. Ultimately, Warren Harding called him out on Article 10, and that was how he lost the support of Hoover, Coolidge, and others. I think it's interesting he talks about the irreconcilables. So that should wrap up Wilson. We see Wilson was a bit of an idealist, and that this sort of idealism and inability to compromise and inability to consider the consequences of one's actions in favor of just adhering in a die-hard, dedicated, stubborn manner to an ideal or a vision or some sort of goal that's perhaps not even all that directly related to tangible reality is, well, it's idealism. It's the methodology of the ideologue. And it is usually disastrous in consequence. So jumping forward to the end of the Cold War, he says, quote, "For half a century, America had had an enemy that united us. Containment of communism was the cause that gave clarity and coherence to our foreign policy. Almost all the great events of our lives had to do with the Cold War. The Berlin airlift, the Marshall Plan, Korea, the space race, the wall, the missile crisis, Vietnam, East-West summits, the opening to China, SALT agreements, Detente, the Euro missiles, the Contras, the Reagan Doctrine, SDI. In each presidential campaign, the question of which candidate could better deal with Moscow was almost always paramount. For most of America's foreign policy elite, the Cold War was their vocation. For the American right, it was the unifying cause. Now, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States had no great enemy, and no satisfactory answer to the question in the war movies of our childhood. What are you going to do, Joe, when this is all over? What does the last superpower do when no other power challenges it? What is the moral equivalent of resisting a world-girdling totalitarian empire? What is America's cause now? Hitler, Tojo, Stalin, Mao, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev united us. Their passing brought a fractionalization of foreign policy. We now argue over every policy decision and presidential action because we no longer have an overarching cause to explain or justify them. From 1945 to 1989, our communist enemy made the job of foreign policy architect simple. Friends stood on America's side, foes sided with Moscow. The difference between crafting foreign policy then and now is the difference between arithmetic and calculus. Even before the wall came down, the National Interest magazine invited contributors to a forum on a new foreign policy for an era in which no great enemy threatened. Neoconservatives responded with alacrity and giddy calls for imposing a Pax Americana or global hegemony on a planet unable to resist the world's last superpower. Ex-LBJ aide Ben Wattenberg called for a worldwide crusade for democracy. Columnist Charles Krauthammer wrote that it should be our wish and work to integrate America, Europe, and Japan into a super-sovereign entity that would be economically, culturally, and politically hegemonic in the world. This new universalism, said Krauthammer, would require the conscious depreciation not only of American sovereignty, but of the notion of sovereignty in general. This is not as outrageous as it sounds. Not to Krauthammer, but surely to the Patriot Fathers. The Krauthammer superstate would be a betrayal of everything for which the Republic stood. Did we really break free of the British Empire so that we might imitate and surpass it by colluding with Japan and Europe to dictate to mankind? In a rebuttal piece titled America First and Second and Third, I wrote that Krauthammer's vision was un-American and failed the fundamental test of any foreign policy. Americans will not fight for it. A nation's purpose, I added, is to be discovered not by consulting ideologies, but by reviewing its history, by searching the hearts of its people. What is it for which we Americans have always been willing to fight? Lord Macaulay gave us the answer. And how can men die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods? Nowhere in the Constitution is Congress or the President authorized to conscript the wealth of the nation or the blood of its sons for crusades. This is not the Holy Roman Empire. Conservatives who believe our Cold War triumph empowers us to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy should cease calling themselves conservatives. Urging adoption of a policy of enlightened nationalism, I wrote, if the Cold War is ending, what are the terms of honorable peace that will permit us to go home? Are they not withdrawal of the Red Army back within its own frontiers, liberation of Central Europe and the Baltic republics, reunification of Germany and de-Leninization of Moscow, i.e., overthrow of the imperialist party that has prosecuted the 70 Years' War against the West? Once Russia is rescued from Leninism, its distant colonies, Cuba and Nicaragua, must eventually fall, just as the outposts of Japan's empire, cut off from the home islands, fell like ripe apples into the lap of General MacArthur. Withdrawal of the Red Army from Europe would remove from the hand of Gorbachev's successor the military instrument of Marxist restoration. The compensating concession we should offer? Total withdrawal of U.S. troops from Europe. If Moscow will get out, we will get out. Once the Red Army goes home, the reason for keeping a U.S. Army in Europe vanishes. 40 years after the Marshall Plan, it is time Europe conscripted the soldiers for its own defense. Miraculously, within 2 years, the great cause we had worked for, prayed for, fought for all our lives had triumphed. The Red Army had gone home. The Soviet Empire had collapsed. The Baltic states were free. The USSR had broken up into 15 nations. Ukraine was free. Never in history had so odious an empire vanished so swiftly. In 2 years, the Soviet Empire disappeared from the earth, and the Russia over which Boris Yeltsin was providing extended no further west, save for the tiny enclave of Kaliningrad that it had at the time of Peter the Great. All that America had ever sought had come to pass. Yet rather than seize the opportunity to pull up our tripwires around the world and shed unwanted commitments, to recapture our freedom of action and restore a traditional foreign policy, Republican internationalists were now joining with Wilsonian globalists to tie America down like Gulliver in some new world order where U.S. wealth and power would be put at the service of causes having nothing to do with the vital interests of the United States. End quote. So you see mention here of this forum sponsored by the National Interest magazine. They invited contributors to discuss a new foreign policy that would prevail at the end of the Cold War. And this was even before the wall came down. This, I guess, a set of articles about articles and perhaps responses to articles, an ongoing conversation within the National Interest magazine about where to go next. And it seems as though there's a sort of back and forth conflict between Charles Krauthammer and Pat Buchanan, between essentially the neoconservatives and Pat Buchanan leading the paleoconservatives, basically saying, look, let's look back to the way America was before the Cold War, before the rise of communism. Let's look also at how the Republican Party was before the Cold War. We don't need to carry on the Cold War policy that we only adopted on account of the Cold War. We should stick to traditional American foreign policy, which is not to be involved or entangled with European conflicts or foreign conflicts in general that don't have a direct and immediate impact on America's interests. So Pat Buchanan really supports the non-interventionist / isolationist position that I think Trump supports as well, and especially Trump supporters support. The Republican base more and more is the anti-war base. Democrats have lost a lot of their anti-war tendencies, I think, and Republicans have become more concerned that American money, American supplies, American weapons being shipped overseas is extending foreign conflicts that create instability in the world. And I'm sure that there are still Democrats that believe that we should not be supplying weapons to the world, especially Israel. There is definitely a contingent in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party. There are some on both sides that think that we should not be supplying weapons to countries all over the world. And so I'm sure that there's strange bedfellows that can be made in this fight against the total domination by the military-industrial complex of America's foreign policy. Politicians in the pockets of these defense industries that keep stoking the fires of foreign conflict so that American corporations can continue to make money selling weapons overseas and generating instability. And I think that's interesting the way that the divisions in this country don't always align clearly with the party divisions. Everything is shifting and changing under our feet pretty regularly. So moving on from there, one last section that I want to read, not particularly long, but just kind of the overview, is where he says, quote, "The fatal flaw in the globalist vision is that it is utopian. It envisions a world that has never existed and can never exist because it is contrary to fallen human nature. History has shown again and again that men do not give loyalty, love, and allegiance to entities greater than the nation. No world community can ever replace the patria. Ultimately, men fight and die for the ashes of their fathers and the temples of their gods, not some new world order. Who would give his life for the United Nations? In crises, men invariably take care of their own wives and children first, so patriots will always put their country first. Our country, may she always be in the right, but our country right or wrong." Despite the trendy disparagement of the idea, Stephen Decatur's toast yet resonates. Republican internationalists and neoconservatives understand this. Their dream of America as a benevolent global hegemon fails for a different reason. It is not rooted in America's history or its heart, and if it cannot be found there, it will not move a people. Unlike Romans and British, Americans make poor imperialists. A brief, bloody Philippine insurrection cured America of the lust for empire, which is why we never annexed Cuba. After World Wars I and II, the United States could have dictated to the world. Instead, the universal clamor was to bring the boys home. This is not the hearty stuff of empire. Americans will fight when they feel their honor has been impugned, as with the Maine and at Pearl Harbor, and they will sustain an interventionist policy if some great hostile power clearly intends our destruction, as we believed the empire of Lenin and Stalin did. But no malevolent empire threatens us today. And despite the efforts to create a new Hitler in Saddam Hussein and Slobodan Milosevic, they both fall short of the mark. Thus, all that heroic chatter about global hegemony, a crusade for democracy, and on to Baghdad has faded away. Americans don't want to build a new world order. They want to build a better America. Perhaps that is unheroic, but that is who we are. End quote. So that's pretty cool. That he goes on from there to talk about what he calls enlightened nationalism, and just to sort of, he describes it as a third school or like a third way of doing things, traditionalist nationalist. But I'm not going to get too into that. I think it's belaboring the point. We get where he's coming from, that we're not going to be binding ourselves to international allegiances. We're not going to be trying to nation build. We're not going to be trying to spread democracy. We're not going to be utopian. He says the big problem with globalism is that it is utopian. We're not globalists. We don't think globally. We put our wives and children first. In an emergency, we put our people first. We put our nation first. This is natural. This is part of human nature, and that's why nationalism is conducive to human nature, is that we are essentially tribal people. We put ourselves and our families and our nations first, and we respect the human race. We love the human race, but we don't put the human race first. We put ourselves first. We can try to convince ourselves we are different than we are, but what would be the point in that? So that's the basic synopsis of non-interventionism, or if you are comfortable with the phrase, isolationism, one of the three planks of Buchananite paleoconservatism, which those three being protectionism, isolationism, and restrictionism at the border. The defensive stance that makes for a strong nation. So, with all that said, I thank you very much for listening, and I will talk to you again next time.